Night had fallen over Jerusalem with a density that felt almost tangible. It was not only the darkness that wrapped the streets, it was a deep, ancient sensation that swirled among the stones, as if the entire city held secrets too heavy to be spoken aloud. The disciples walked behind Jesus, accompanying him without daring to break the silence. Jerusalem, even while asleep, carried a presence that demanded respect. And that night, its silent breath seemed to watch them from every corner. Jesus moved forward with a calm step, like someone who knew every crack in the city and every shadow resting upon its walls. The moon illuminated part of his tunic and left the rest in darkness. It was a powerful image, the Master in the night of Jerusalem, guiding his disciples toward a place they did not yet know, but that he had carried in his heart since hours earlier. In the distance, the temple dominated the view, rising over the hill like a house of light and silence. During the day, the voices of the teachers of the law had echoed under its porticos. The debates, the questions strategically crafted to trap Jesus, the looks that examined him as if he were something foreign. All of that remained fresh in the disciples' memory. Every step they took away from the temple felt like relief, but also an invitation to reflect on what they had lived. Peter walked with his fists clenched. He was an impulsive man, and what he had witnessed during the day had left him unsettled. He did not understand why the very men who possessed the most knowledge seemed to show the least heart. He could not comprehend how someone could listen to the Master speak with such clarity and still respond with harshness, cunning, and calculated coldness. Each question aimed at Jesus that day had carried a hidden blade, as if every word had been crafted to wound without drawing blood. John, walking beside him, sensed Peter's state of mind. Both had seen the tension build among those surrounding Jesus. For John, the most painful part was not the confrontation, but the lack of love. He had watched Jesus speak with a serenity unmatched by any man, and yet the city reacted as though his light unsettled them. It was a contrast that weighed heavily on his chest. Jesus continued along a narrow street, leaving behind the houses that hid in the shadows. The disciples knew he was searching for a specific place. Jerusalem had many courtyards, many quiet corners, many spaces where one could withdraw to pray without being disturbed. And Jesus, who knew the human heart better than anyone, also knew the places where he could rest in the presence of the Father. When they reached an intersection, Jesus lifted his gaze. The moon stood high in the sky, spreading its silver light over the walls. The cool air carried the scent of oil from the lamps still burning in some homes. The disciples realized that the Master had found the place he had been looking for. It was a wide courtyard, surrounded by columns and shielded by walls that kept out the noise of the city. A perfect place for what was about to happen. Jesus entered the courtyard without saying a word. The stone floor was cold, but it carried a firmness that invited stillness. The disciples followed him in silence. Each one found a place around the Master, forming a natural circle, as they had done many times on nights of teaching. Jesus walked to the center of the courtyard, knelt down, and closed his eyes. The silence deepened. The disciples could feel the presence of the Father surrounding Jesus, as if peace itself descended upon him from above. The way he breathed, the calm in his face, the way his hands rested on his knees. Everything spoke of a connection none of them could fully understand, yet all of them admired. Jesus began to pray in silence, but the strength of his prayer seemed to fill the courtyard. Andrew was the first to notice. A sensation of calm began to spread around them, as if the very night had become lighter. James, who usually had a strong temperament, felt something inside him soften. And Thomas, whose mind often raced with questions, found himself breathing without the anxious rhythm that so often accompanied him. Several minutes passed before Jesus opened his eyes. He looked at his disciples with an expression that blended tenderness and depth. They waited, knowing that whatever the Master said next would carry a weight that would mark the night. Jesus slowly stood up. The moon illuminated his face. He took a few steps toward one of the columns and rested his hand on the stone. He observed the walls as if he could see beyond them, beyond Jerusalem, beyond even the night. The disciples sensed that Jesus carried something in his heart he wanted to share, something he had been holding for them. "Jerusalem is a city that seeks peace," Jesus said softly, "and yet fears receiving it." The disciples exchanged glances. That sentence echoed everything they had seen that day. The city was filled with conflict, disputes, and voices clashing with one another. But Jesus was not only speaking about the city. He was speaking about human hearts. "Today you saw restless hearts," Jesus continued. "Hearts that cling to argument because they fear what truth might reveal." John stepped closer, unwilling to miss a single word. "When truth arrives," Jesus said, "peace arrives with it. But many fear losing their arguments, their certainties, their positions. And so, instead of opening themselves, they close." Peter breathed deeply. It explained everything he had seen within the temple. The harsh looks, the loaded questions, the responses that sought to entrap the Master. All of it came from hearts unwilling to accept truth because truth required change. And change is frightening. Jesus walked a few steps further. The night seemed to lean toward him. Every movement conveyed serenity, but also a profound firmness. "You know," he continued, "that peace is not something found outside. Peace is born within the heart that opens to the light." The disciples listened with complete attention. "That is why I brought you here tonight," Jesus said, "because I want you to understand something that will accompany you your entire lives." Jesus lifted his eyes toward the sky. The moon shone over him, as if its light descended directly from heaven to illuminate his words. "The peace the Father gives," he said, "is not the same peace the world seeks." His words fell upon the night like an immense truth. The disciples felt Jesus preparing their hearts for something deeper. The tension of the day, the hostility of many men, everything faded before the Master's presence. Jesus stepped toward them, one by one, looking at them with a tenderness that disarmed them. "Today you were surrounded by arguments," he said. "You saw how some tried to provoke fear in you, how others wanted to make you doubt. But I tell you this, no external conflict can rule the heart filled with the peace of heaven." The disciples felt something shift within them, as if an inner door was opening. Jesus stopped at the center of the courtyard. His voice became softer, deeper, filled with divine mystery. It was then that Jesus left a code that could transform everything. The code is, "My peace I leave you, my peace I give you." The disciples remained motionless. It was not just a phrase. It was a gift. It was an eternal declaration. It was a doorway into something the world could never offer. And Jesus spoke it like someone offering a treasure meant to remain forever. Peter felt the weight he carried melt away. John felt a new light enter his heart. Andrew felt the tension of the day dissolve like smoke. Thomas felt the wind itself carrying the presence of that peace. But Jesus was not done. He stepped closer to them, with a gaze that knew every wound, every doubt, every hidden thought. "I do not give it to you as the world gives," Jesus added. The disciples understood. The world gave a fragile peace, one that depended entirely on circumstances. Jesus offered a peace that remained even when the storm stayed present. Jesus knelt once again in the center of the courtyard. The disciples knelt with him. The silence that fell was so profound it felt as though the entire city had paused to listen. And that was the first part of the night, a night that still had much to reveal. As they remained kneeling, the wind shifted direction. It carried with it the distant aroma of incense still burning in some nearby home, and the faint echo of a conversation lost between the alleyways. Jerusalem breathed in its own way. Even at night, even in silence, the city was alive. But in that courtyard, where Jesus prayed with his disciples gathered around him, the atmosphere was different. The air felt lighter, as if the peace Jesus had just given them had descended from heaven to rest upon their shoulders. Jesus slowly opened his eyes. The moonlight reflected in them, and the depth of his gaze was so intense that the disciples felt they were standing before a divine mystery. Something they could not fully grasp, yet something that pulled them inward with irresistible force. Jesus stood up gently. Even the movement itself radiated calm, as if he could transform any place into a sanctuary simply by being present. When he rose to his feet, the group did the same. The disciples formed a semicircle around the Master, watching his every gesture. Jesus walked to a nearby column and placed his hand upon the stone. The cold texture contrasted with the warmth of his presence. "Come with me," Jesus said softly. The group obeyed without question. Jesus left the courtyard through a narrow passage that vanished into the darkness. Torches burning in a few homes lit fragments of the path, but most of it was guided by the moon. Jerusalem was a maze of narrow streets and slopes winding among stone houses. At that hour, it was nearly deserted. As they walked, Jesus stopped in front of a simple house with a wooden door and an extinguished lamp beside the frame. The house seemed deeply asleep, yet Jesus looked at it as though it held a hidden meaning. "John," he said suddenly. The youngest disciple stepped forward. "Yes, Master. Do you remember when we first visited this house?" John leaned in to look more closely. He recognized it. It was the home where Jesus had healed a child who had been feverish for days. The parents had come desperately. The mother held the boy tightly, afraid of losing him. And Jesus, with a gesture full of tenderness, had restored him to normal life, back into the warmth of his home. "I remember, Lord," John replied. Jesus smiled softly. "Every house in this city has a story," he said. "Some are stories of faith, others of fear, some of love, others of confusion. And each one reflects what lies inside the heart." The words hung in the night. Jesus continued walking. The disciples followed him, trying to absorb what they had just heard. The Master spoke of Jerusalem as if he were speaking of a living being. Every stone, every street, every home seemed to form part of a greater story. They continued until reaching a wider street where two lit torches illuminated the entrance. Jesus stopped there. The area was more open, and from that point they could see part of the temple in the distance, its white columns reflecting the moonlight. Jesus watched the horizon for several seconds. "Listen to this," he said without moving his gaze from the temple. "The peace I have given you tonight is not only for quiet moments. It is for the moments when you feel surrounded by the conflicts of others." Peter narrowed his eyes, trying to grasp the depth of Jesus' words. "You have seen what happens when the human heart is ruled by fear," Jesus continued. "Fear hardens. Fear divides. Fear turns a man's face into something that no longer recognizes truth." Thomas took a deep breath. He knew Jesus was speaking about what they had witnessed in the temple, when the Pharisees approached with carefully constructed words meant to trap the Master. They were afraid of losing influence, afraid of what Jesus' light really meant. Jesus turned toward them. "Do not let the fear of others become your own fear," he said. "What you receive tonight is stronger than the terror that governs many." The disciples felt a slight shiver, not from cold, but from recognition. Those words pierced deeply. Jesus stepped forward until he stood where the light of one of the torches fell upon him. The flame flickered with the wind, casting moving shadows across the ground. "When a heart is filled with the peace of heaven," Jesus said, "it does not matter how many voices try to shake it. It does not matter how many criticisms arise. It does not matter how many arguments appear. The peace that comes from the Father remains." Andrew slowly lifted his hand, unsure if he should speak. "Master," he said cautiously, "how can I know if the peace I feel comes from heaven, or if it is only a momentary calm?" Jesus looked at him with deep tenderness. "The peace that comes from heaven does not depend on what happens outside," he answered. "It remains even when everything around you seems to fall into darkness." Andrew lowered his gaze, reflecting on the meaning. He, who had often struggled with doubt, understood that there was a profound difference between the peace born from circumstance and the peace born from God. Jesus stepped a few paces away, observing the street that descended into the lower part of the city. "Come," he said again. The disciples followed him. They walked down the street, descending a gentle slope that led to a quieter area of Jerusalem. There, the sound of the wind was stronger, moving the disciples' cloaks as if urging them forward. Jesus stopped by an aged stone wall marked by time. He ran his hand across it, like someone reading a story written in its cracks. "This city has seen many conflicts," he said. "It has seen kings, prophets, battles, and tears. But it has also seen faith, hope, and love. Jerusalem is a reflection of the human heart, full of contrasts." John stepped closer. "Lord," he asked, "is that why you wanted to give us the code tonight?" Jesus turned to him. "Yes, John. Because there will be moments when you walk among tensions equal to or greater than those of today. And you will need a peace that does not depend on what happens outside. You will need a peace that sustains you from within." John nodded, as did the others. They understood that Jesus was giving them something they would need, not only for that night, but for the years ahead. Jesus continued walking, and the disciples followed until they reached an area where the houses stood farther apart. The silence was deeper there, and the shadows moved more slowly. Jesus stopped again. "Look," he said, pointing to a small house with a lamp lit in the window. "Do you see that light?" The disciples nodded. "That light," Jesus continued, "does not illuminate the whole city, but it gives enough light for no one to stumble near it." Peter frowned slightly, trying to understand. "That is how the peace I have given you works," Jesus said. "It may not change everything around you, but it will change what you carry inside, and that will be enough to keep you from stumbling in the darkness." The disciples remained silent. The metaphor sank deeply, leaving an invisible seal upon them. Jesus walked to a small stone bench beside an olive tree. He sat down, and the disciples formed a circle around him. The moonlit glow illuminated their faces, and for a moment all of Jerusalem seemed to disappear. Only the Master and his disciples existed, united in a night that would remain forever engraved in their souls. Jesus took a deep breath. "Listen," he said. "The peace that comes from heaven is not an emotion. It is a presence. It is the Father walking with you." A gentle tremor passed through them. "And when that presence dwells in your heart," he added, "no external conflict can destroy what you carry inside." Jesus looked at each one of them, as if wanting to imprint that truth deeply within their hearts. "Tonight," he continued, "I want you to understand that peace is a gift I have come to bring, a gift that belongs to you." The moon shone brighter, the wind quieted, and the disciples felt that this night still had much to reveal. The wind rose again while Jesus remained seated beneath the olive tree. It was a gentle wind, yet it carried with it a distant murmur, as if the city were whispering something far away in the darkness. The disciples shifted around the Master, settling into more comfortable positions. Some leaned their backs against the trunk of the olive tree. Others crossed their legs and bent forward, attentive to every gesture of Jesus. They had already walked through several corners of Jerusalem that night, and yet they felt that the true teaching had only just begun. Jesus stayed silent for a few moments. He looked at the street that opened before them, winding through the shadows. From time to time, the moonlight revealed a fragment of stone before leaving it once again in darkness. The disciples realized that Jesus was reading the night the way a teacher reads a scroll filled with meaning. "Look at that street," Jesus said at last, pointing with his hand. The disciples followed the direction of his gesture. "During the day," he continued, "that street is filled with voices, merchants, teachers, families, pilgrims. But at night, it becomes silent. And yet, that does not mean it has no story." Matthew tilted his head, intrigued. He had walked through that area many times when he was a tax collector. He knew the main roads, but also the quieter alleys. And he knew that even empty streets held memories. Jesus rose slowly from the stone bench and began walking toward the moonlit street. The disciples stood up and followed him. When they reached the entrance, Jesus paused again. "Every street," he said, "carries the footprints of those who have walked along it." Peter looked down at the ground, worn by countless steps. "But it carries more than their footprints," Jesus added. "It carries their decisions." Thomas frowned, trying to perceive the deeper meaning. "What do you mean, Lord?" he asked. Jesus turned toward him. "Every person who walks through this city carries an inner battle," he replied, "and the streets witness those battles. Some people walk with fear, others walk with anger, others walk with hope, others with confusion. and each one leaves something behind. The disciples remained silent. Jesus began walking slowly down the street, moving between shadows and light. The moon illuminated his steps as though an invisible lamp from heaven guided him. "This is why peace is so necessary," he continued, "because the human heart, just like the streets of Jerusalem, keeps traces, and they are not always light traces." John felt a shiver run through him at the sound of those words. He was someone who paid attention to what happened around him, and he knew that Jerusalem was a place where people walked carrying weights that were not always visible. Jesus lifted his gaze to a balcony where a faint lamp was still burning. Its light seemed to resist the darkness that filled the rest of the street. "Do you see that lamp?" he asked. The disciples nodded. "The light of that lamp," Jesus said, "is not strong. It does not illuminate the whole street, but it shines enough so that the home behind that door is not completely dark." Peter stepped closer. "Is that how the peace you gave us tonight works, Master?" he asked. "A light that remains even when the darkness is great?" Jesus looked at him with a mixture of affirmation and tenderness. "Yes, Peter. The peace I have given you is not a light that brightens the entire city at once. It is a light that begins within you, and from there it can guide every step, even in the night." The disciples absorbed the meaning of his words. Jesus continued walking, and they followed. With each step, the street seemed to become part of the message. There was something in its silence that made the Master's teaching feel even deeper. When they reached the end of the street, Jesus turned onto a path that gently descended toward an area near the wall. From there, part of the Kidron Valley could be seen, dark beneath the starry sky. The wind blew more strongly, and the movement of the disciples' cloaks created a soft rustling sound that accompanied their steps. Jesus stopped at a point where the path opened into a small natural overlook. From there, Jerusalem stretched out like a mosaic of shadows and light. The disciples looked at the city beside the Master. The temple shone on the height, like a silent beacon. "Look at Jerusalem," Jesus said. "What do you see?" John was the first to answer. "I see a beautiful city, but also a city filled with tensions." Jesus nodded. "That is what human eyes see," he said. "But there is something deeper." The disciples waited. Jesus extended his hand toward the city. "Jerusalem is a heart," he said. "A heart that sometimes beats with hope, but sometimes beats with fear. A heart that desires peace, but often does not know how to receive it." Peter exhaled slowly. Those words explained more than what he himself had understood about the people's behavior during the day. "And you," Jesus continued, "will walk through that heart. You will encounter its lights and its shadows, its joys and its wounds, its searching and its rejection." The disciples listened without blinking. "That is why," Jesus added, "peace is essential, because when you carry the peace of heaven within you, you can walk through any human heart without being dragged by its conflicts." Jesus allowed that truth to settle into the night. The disciples felt something deep imprint itself inside them. Then Jesus turned and led them to a higher area of the path. The air was cooler, and the scent of damp stone mingled with the faint aroma of a nearby fig tree. As they climbed, Jesus spoke again. "The world seeks peace through agreements," he said. through words, through truces, but those things do not touch the heart. Matthew raised his eyes. "And the peace of heaven, Master?" he asked. Jesus answered without stopping, "The peace of heaven touches the heart, and when a heart changes, the world around it changes too." They reached a small space between two stone walls. The moonlight created a strange effect, illuminating part of the ground and leaving the rest in darkness. The disciples sat. They were tired from the walk, but they did not want to lose a single detail of what Jesus was revealing. Jesus stood for a moment, gazing at the starry sky. "The Father," he said, "does not ask you to carry the weight of others' conflicts. He asks you to carry his peace so you can walk in the midst of them." Peter breathed deeply. That phrase pierced him. He had always been one to act with strength and impulse. But Jesus was speaking of another strength, one that did not impose itself with force, but with serenity. Jesus lowered his gaze toward them. "This city," he said, "will teach you that even in the holiest places there can be tensions. But it will also teach you that in the most tense places, peace can enter." John nodded slowly. He, who carried everything in his heart, knew that this night would be remembered as one of the deepest he would ever live with the Master. "The peace I have given you," Jesus continued, "does not need circumstances to change in order to manifest. It transforms whatever it touches." The wind rose again, stirring the disciples' cloaks. None of them spoke. Jesus was taking them to an understanding they could not have reached on their own. "Sometimes," he added, "you will walk through places where the decisions of others create confusion, where words are harsh, where justice seems far away. But if you keep the peace of heaven, you will not lose your way." Jesus stepped closer to them. "The peace of heaven," he said, "is not something you receive only once. It is something that must be renewed every day, every morning, every night, every moment." The disciples listened with fervent attention. "That is why," Jesus continued, "this night matters, because now you know that even in a city full of tension, the peace of the Father can descend like a gentle light that shines from within." Jesus extended his hand toward them. "This light," he said, "is stronger than any darkness, stronger than any conflict, stronger than any fear." The disciples felt that truth engrave itself into the depths of their souls, and they understood that the teaching of this night would be a foundation for everything that would come afterward. The night continued. Jerusalem kept breathing, and Jesus still had much to say. Jesus remained standing for a few moments, observing his disciples in silence. The night was so still they could hear the wind brushing softly against the walls of the city. In that small space between Jerusalem's narrow streets, the disciples felt they were standing on the edge of something immense, something that did not belong only to that night, but to an eternal mystery unfolding before their eyes. Jesus took a few steps forward until he stood at the very center of the group. The moonlight fell upon him so precisely that it seemed as though the entire sky were focusing its gaze on him. "You have heard the code," Jesus said, his voice becoming part of the night itself. "But now you must understand it with your hearts." The disciples leaned in slightly, attentive. "My peace I leave with you," Jesus repeated, this time with a different cadence. "My peace I give you." Peter swallowed. John narrowed his eyes. Andrew felt something ignite within him. James placed both hands on his knees, as if bracing himself to take in every word. Jesus continued, "I do not give it to you as the world gives." Thomas tilted his head, slowly processing the difference between what he knew and what Jesus was offering. "The world gives peace in fragments," Jesus said, "in pieces that depend on agreements, on tense silences, on conditions. That peace breaks at the first collision, at the first conflict, at the first harsh word." The disciples understood perfectly. Each one of them had experienced the fragility of human peace. They had lived moments of tension even among themselves, arguments born of exhaustion, impulses, or differences. But the peace Jesus described went far beyond all of that. "The peace I give you," Jesus continued, "cannot break. It does not depend on the situation. It does not depend on the city. It does not depend on the voices that try to unsettle you." Jesus walked slowly among them. His presence shone like a beacon lighting even the deepest places of their souls. "The peace I give you comes from the Father," he added, "and what comes from the Father remains, even when everything else changes." John felt a soft shiver run down his spine. He had seen that peace in Jesus all day long, when the Pharisees provoked him, when the crowds pressed in, when the city buzzed with opinions and rumors. Jesus never lost his serenity. He walked with a calm so profound it unsettled even his enemies. That was the peace now being placed into their hands. Jesus paused once more beside the olive tree, laying his hand gently on the trunk. The ancient would seem to absorb the presence of the Master, as if the tree itself were listening. "You know," Jesus said, looking at each of them, "that you will not always be together as you are tonight." The disciples tensed slightly. Jesus noticed, but continued with gentleness, "There will be days when you walk alone in cities you do not know. There will be moments when others reject you. There will be nights when you feel the weight is too heavy." His words were not harsh. They were true, spoken by a master who loved his disciples deeply and wanted their hearts to be steady even when he would no longer be physically with them. "And when that moment comes," Jesus added, his voice touching their souls, "remember this night. Remember this code. Remember that the peace I give you cannot be taken away." Peter slowly clenched his fists, not in fear, but in recognition that these words would become essential for his future. Jesus walked toward the opening of the narrow passage where they stood. From there they could see a wider stretch of street, faintly illuminated by moonlight. He stood at the center and motioned for them to approach. "I want you to see something," he said. The disciples gathered around him. Jesus gestured toward the horizon of Jerusalem, outlined by shadows and the majesty of the temple rising above everything else. "This city," Jesus said, "is a reflection of the human heart, capable of building temples of faith and at the same time raising walls of division." None of the disciples moved. "And just as the city has dark alleys," he continued, "it also has places where light enters even when no one expects it." Jesus lowered his hand and looked at them with a depth that seemed to carve his words into their memory. "That is what you will be," he said. "You will be light where others see darkness. You will be peace in the midst of conflict. You will be calm in the midst of arguments. You will be hope in the midst of fear." John lowered his gaze for a moment, moved by the magnitude of the mission Jesus was describing. He knew those words were not only for that night, they were for his entire life. Jesus continued, "But to be that, you must first receive the peace of heaven. You cannot offer what you do not have." The disciples nodded silently. "That is why I have brought this code tonight," Jesus said. "Because when peace is within you, everything you do will be sustained by it." Jesus stepped closer to the group, his mantle brushing lightly against Peter. "Remember this," he said. "The peace of heaven does not impose itself. It is poured out." The phrase descended over them with divine gentleness. "And just as it is poured out," he added, "you too will pour it out wherever you go." Jesus turned toward the street leading back to the first courtyard where their night had begun. He started to walk, and the disciples followed him. Jerusalem remained quiet, its houses asleep beneath the starry sky. But there was a change in the air, an inner light the disciples could now feel. When they returned to the original courtyard, Jesus stood once more at its center, just as he had at the beginning. The disciples formed a circle around him, exactly as they had hours earlier. The wind had quieted. The distant torches still burned, but the true light was among them. Jesus closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed deeply, and when he opened them, there was a serenity so profound that none of the disciples could look away. "The time has come," he said softly. Silence became absolute. "To activate this code, repeat after me." The disciples leaned forward, feeling that something sacred was about to happen. Jesus raised his voice, not with force, but with a clarity that made every stone in the courtyard vibrate. "Lord Jesus, pour your peace into my heart." The disciples repeated, "Let your presence order my thoughts and calm my conflicts." The disciples repeated, "You said, 'My peace I leave with you, my peace I give you.'" The disciples repeated, their eyes now filled with tears. "I receive your peace, the peace that comes from heaven and cannot be taken from me." The disciples repeated. Jesus lowered his voice, but not the strength of the declaration. "The code is activated." The words seemed to echo beyond the courtyard, beyond Jerusalem itself, as if ascending directly to heaven. Jesus opened his eyes, and the disciples knew that this night would be etched forever into their souls. The peace they had received was not an idea. It was a presence, and that presence would walk with them always. The moon shone over them. The wind rose again, soft as a caress across their faces. The night had ended, but the peace that descended upon them in Jerusalem would live